The mountain man didn't look like someone who understood mercy. 6'4" of weathered muscle, scarred knuckles, and a silence that made grown men step aside at the trading post. But when Jacob Thorne knelt in the mud outside the crumbling church, his massive hands cradling hers like she was something holy, he said the words that broke her. "You ain't Barren. The world is." 3 months earlier, Grace Whitmore had been standing in almost the same spot, listening to very different words. "The marriage is annulled." Reverend Morris had spoken without meeting her eyes, his voice flat as old bread, "on grounds of your inability to fulfill wifely duties." Grace had stood perfectly still in her worn blue dress. The one she'd mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her spine was straight. She would not cry in front of these people. Her husband, former husband, Daniel Whitmore, stood beside the Reverend with his new bride-to-be, a soft-faced girl of 19 whose belly was already swelling beneath her Sunday dress. The girl had the decency to look at the floor. Daniel did not. 5 years, Grace said quietly. 5 years I kept your house, worked your garden, nursed you through fever, and gave me no sons. Daniel's voice was cold. "A wife's got one duty that matters, Grace. You failed." The Reverend cleared his throat. "The annulment is legal and binding. You'll vacate the homestead by week's end. Daniel has generously agreed to let you take your personal belongings." Generous. The word tasted like ashes. Grace was 32 years old. In the Montana Territory of 1889, that made her practically ancient. A woman her age, cast off for barrenness, had exactly 3 options: find family willing to take her in as unpaid labor, sell herself to a brothel, or disappear into the wilderness and hope the cold took her quickly. Grace had no family. Her parents had died in a ferry accident when she was 16. She'd married Daniel at 17 because he'd offered stability, a roof, a future. Now she had nothing. She took her belongings, 2 dresses, a quilt her mother had made, a Bible, and a small wooden box containing her wedding band, which she'd removed the moment Daniel told her he'd found someone fertile, and walked out of the only home she'd known as a married woman. The town of Pine Haven was small, and news traveled faster than wildfire. By the time Grace reached the boarding house, the proprietress met her at the door with crossed arms. "No rooms available. I can pay." No rooms. 3 more places turned her away. The message was clear. A barren woman was bad luck. Contagious shame. No one wanted her shadow darkening their doorstep. Grace spent that first night in the livery stable, curled in the hay, listening to horses shift and stamp in their stalls. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury for women who still had hope. The next morning, she sold her wedding band to the jeweler for less than it was worth and bought a week's worth of bread and dried meat. Then she started walking north, toward the deep timber country where the town's reach ended and the wilderness began. She'd heard stories about the high country, about men who lived alone in the mountains, avoiding civilization like it was plague-ridden. Trappers, hunters, hermits, dangerous men, people said. Men who'd forgotten how to live among decent folk. Grace figured she was no longer decent folk, so maybe that's where she belonged. The trail climbed steadily through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The air grew thinner, colder. Grace's worn boots slipped on loose scree. Her lungs burned. But she kept walking, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. On the 3rd day, the snow started. It came suddenly, thick and heavy, turning the world white in minutes. Grace had no coat thick enough for this. No shelter. No fire-starting tools beyond a single match she was saving for absolute emergency. She pushed forward until her legs gave out, then sank against the trunk of a massive pine. The cold seeped through her dress, through her skin, into her bones. She thought about Daniel's new bride, warm and safe and wanted. She thought about the empty cradle she'd carved by hand, the one Daniel had burned the day he told her she was defective. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, a man was standing over her. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, wearing a bearskin coat that made him look like something out of ancient myth. Dark beard, ice-blue eyes, a face that could have been carved from the mountain itself. "You lost." His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. Grace tried to speak. Her lips were too numb. The man crouched down, studying her with the same careful attention he might give a wounded animal. Then he scooped her up like she weighed nothing and started walking. Grace wanted to protest, wanted to ask where he was taking her. But the warmth radiating from his chest was the first comfort she'd felt in days, and her body surrendered to it before her mind could object. She woke in a cabin. A real one, not a trapper's shack, solid log walls, a riverstone fireplace, glass windows, and thick wool blankets covering her on a rope bed. The mountain man sat across the room, whittling something from a piece of cedar. "You're awake," he said without looking up. "Good. Thought I'd have to bury you come morning." Grace sat up slowly, testing her limbs. Everything ached, but nothing was frostbitten. Someone had removed her wet dress and boots, replaced them with a man's flannel shirt that hung to her knees and thick wool socks. "Who are you?" Her voice came out hoarse. "Jacob Thorne." He set down his whittling. "You got a name?" "Grace Whitmore." "You got people looking for you, Grace Whitmore?" "No." He nodded like that, answered more than the question he'd asked. "Hungry." She was. Starving, actually. Jacob moved to the stove and ladled something from a cast-iron pot into a wooden bowl. Venison stew, rich and thick, with wild onions and chunks of potato. Grace ate 3 bowls while Jacob washed in silence. "Thank you," she said finally. "Storm's passing. I'll take you back to town tomorrow." "No." The word came out sharp. Grace set down the bowl. "I'm not going back." Jacob's ice blue eyes studied her. "Town folk don't take kindly to women wandering alone in the high country. They'll come looking." "They won't." Grace met his gaze. "I'm not wanted there." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be unwanted. "You can stay till you're strong enough to travel," he said. "Then you'll need to figure where you're headed." But the storm didn't pass. It settled in, heavy and relentless, sealing the mountain in white. 3 days became a week. A week became 2. Grace made herself useful. She mended Jacob's shirts, which were all torn or missing buttons. She organized his chaotic shelves of preserves and dried goods. She cooked meals that were more than just meat in a pot. Adding herbs she found hanging in bundles from the rafters. Jacob didn't talk much, but he wasn't unkind. He taught her how to split kindling properly, how to read the sky for weather changes, how to set snares for rabbits. His hands were scarred and enormous, but they moved with surprising gentleness when he showed her how to handle the axe without losing a finger. "You live up here alone?" Grace asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Mostly." "Why?" Jacob was quiet for a long time. "People are cruel when they think you're different. Mountains don't care if you talk right or think right. They just are what they are." Grace understood that more than he knew. One morning, she woke to voices outside. Men's voices. Jacob was already at the door, rifle in hand. Grace peered through the window. 3 riders sat on horseback in the snow. Daniel, Reverend Morris, and the town sheriff. Her stomach dropped. "We're looking for a woman," the sheriff called. "Grace Whitmore. Last seen heading into the high country. Her husband's concerned for her safety." Jacob stepped onto the porch. "Thought you annulled the marriage, Whitmore." Daniel's face went red. "That don't mean I want her dead. She's not right in the head, wandering off like this. We're taking her back." "She's not going." The sheriff's hand moved toward his sidearm. "That's not your decision, Thorne. Step aside." Grace moved before she could think. She stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself between Jacob and the guns. "I'm not going back," she said clearly. "Grace, be reasonable," Reverend Morris began. "A woman alone with a man, unmarried, it's unseemly. Sinful. Come back to town, and we'll find you proper lodging. You turned me away." Grace interrupted. "All of you. You threw me out like garbage because I couldn't give Daniel sons. Now you want to drag me back to protect his reputation." Daniel shifted in his saddle. "I'm offering you charity, Grace. A place in my household as a servant. It's more than you deserve." Jacob's hand tightened on the rifle. "Here's what's going to happen," Grace said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "You're going to ride back down this mountain and tell everyone I died in the storm. Tell them you found my frozen body. Tell them whatever you want. But I'm staying here." "The hell you are," Daniel snarled. "You're my wife." "I was never your wife," Grace said. "You made that clear. And I'm not your property to reclaim when it suits you." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I can't just leave you here with a strange man. Then I'll marry him." The words came out of Grace's mouth before her brain caught up. She turned to Jacob, whose ice blue eyes had gone wide with surprise. "Marry me," Grace said. "Right now? Then they have no legal claim." Jacob stared at her. The silence stretched, so long Grace thought she'd miscalculated everything. Then Jacob lowered the rifle and looked at the Reverend. "You heard her. Perform the ceremony." Reverend Morris sputtered. "This is highly irregular. You're a reverend. She's an unmarried woman. I'm an unmarried man. What's irregular about it? You can't just, there are bans to post, documents to file." "Do it," Jacob said quietly. "Or I'll take her to the circuit judge in Silver Bow when the snow clears, and I'll tell him how Pine Haven's sheriff tried to kidnap a woman against her will." The threat hummed in the frozen air. Finally, Reverend Morris dismounted. The ceremony took 3 minutes. No flowers, no music, no guest beyond 3 furious men who served as hostile witnesses. Grace wore Jacob's flannel shirt and her rebuilt dignity. Jacob stood beside her in his bearskin coat, smelling of wood smoke and pine. When Reverend Morris said, "You may kiss the bride," Jacob simply placed one massive, calloused hand over Grace's and squeezed gently. It was the kindest touch she'd felt in years. Daniel rode off without another word, his face purple with rage. The sheriff and Reverend followed. Their hoofbeats faded into the snow-muffled silence. Grace and Jacob stood on the porch, legally married, practically strangers. "I'm sorry," Grace said finally. "I shouldn't have. You did what you had to," Jacob interrupted. "So did I." "Why?" Grace turned to face him. "Why would you tie yourself to a barren woman? You could have just sent me away." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked back into the cabin, returning with something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the piece of cedar he'd been whittling the night he found her. It was a small carved bird, wings spread in flight, every feather detailed with impossible precision. "I make these," Jacob said quietly. "Every winter. Been doing it for 15 years. I take them down to the trading post in spring, and the factor sells them to rich folks in San Francisco. Last year's batch brought in more money than most men in Pine Haven see in 5 years." Grace stared at the delicate carving, then at the massive scarred hands that had created it. "People in town think I'm a worthless hermit," Jacob continued. "Dangerous. Simple. They don't know I own half the timber rights on this mountain. Don't know I've got a bank account in Helena that could buy Daniel's homestead 10 times over." He set the carving down and met her eyes. They saw what they wanted to see. A brute. Same way they saw you, a defective woman. But I see someone who walked into a blizzard rather than beg for scraps from people who didn't deserve her. I see someone who stood between me and guns without flinching. That ain't Barren, Grace. That's the bravest damn thing I ever witnessed. Grace's throat tightened. "I can't give you children." "Maybe you can't. Maybe I can't either. Never tried, so I don't know. But I do know there's a dozen ways to build a family that don't involve birthing babies." He picked up the carved bird again, turning it in the firelight. "There's a school down in Silver Bow for orphans. Kids whose parents died in mine accidents or got lost to fever. They're always desperate for funding, for people willing to take children in, teach them trades, give them futures." Grace's heart began to pound. "I got money in space," Jacob said. "But I don't got softness. Don't got away with frightened kids. You, though, you got kindness in you that survived 5 years of cruelty. You got strength that walked through a storm. That's what children need. Not a womb. A heart that won't break when they're difficult. Hands that know how to build something from nothing." He held out the carved bird to Grace. "You ain't worthless. You ain't barren. You're the only thing of value that ever walked onto my mountain." Grace took the carving, her hands shaking. The bird's wings were spread wide, frozen in the moment before flight. She thought about the empty cradle Daniel had burned, about the years she'd spent believing her body's failure defined her worth. Then she looked at Jacob, this strange, quiet man who saw her, truly saw her, and called her brave. "I don't love you," Grace whispered. "I know, but I think I could, given time." Jacob's weathered face softened. "Time's something we got plenty of." Spring came slowly to the high country. As the snow melted, Grace and Jacob rode down to Silver Bow. They returned with 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages 6 to 9, who'd lost their parents to a collapsed mine shaft. The children were frightened and half wild. The boy, Tommy, bit Jacob the first day. The older girl, Sarah, refused to speak. The younger girl, Annie, cried every night for her dead mother. Grace held them when they wept. Jacob taught them to carve, to track, to survive. Slowly, the cabin filled with noise, arguments, Laughter, the sound of small feet on wooden floors. Grace's body never gave her children, but her hands built a family from broken pieces, and her heart grew large enough to hold them all. 2 years after the forced wedding in the snow, Jacob knelt in the mud outside the church in Silver Bow, where they'd taken the children for Sunday service. Grace's hands were dirty from helping Annie plant wildflowers. Her dress was patched and worn. Jacob took her hands in his and said the words that finally healed the wound Daniel had carved into her soul. "You ain't barren. The world is. But you, Grace Thorne, you make things grow that the world said was impossible. You're my greatest gift." Grace knelt in the mud beside him and kissed her husband, not because duty demanded it, but because love, real and hard-won, asked her to. Inside the church, 3 children pressed their faces to the window, giggling at the sight of their parents covered in mud and entirely unbothered. The mountain man and the woman the world called worthless had built something no one could take away. A home made of choice, a family built on worth that went deeper than blood, and a love that grew strong in the places where cruelty said nothing could survive.